Well, between 1950 and the 1980s, around 100,000 children were placed in state institutions in New Zealand, either because they were offending in some way or shape, or they were in need of protection and care because of neglect or ill treatment. The problem was that the state failed to identify which children were which, so they were all put in institutions in one community, whether they were had been caught stealing a chocolate bar from a dairy, or whether they were willfully neglected or ill-treated by their parents. And what seemed to happen was that the state didn't quite know what to do with Māori children, and they, instead of looking at foster placements, it may be that Pākehā families were reluctant to take Māori children, or that there were no networks available to the state to connect with whānau or with suitable Māori foster parents. But increasing numbers, a proportion of Māori children ended up in state care. So, by the time you get to the 1980s, the number of Māori children comprised around about 12% of the total population. But the proportion that were in state care were in the 50% plus. And when I became involved with some of those institutions in the 80s, up to 90% of the children in places like Kohitere were Māori. And the numbers who were in those institutions had almost doubled over 10 years. They still had the same number of staff, and the great proportion of the staff were untrained and had no understanding of treating children. And for example, in Kohitere, which is near Levin, a lot of the staff were retired dairy farmers and locals who saw their job as kicking backsides and sorting kids out. So the treatment that was accorded these children was horrific, and they were incapable of managing a lot of children who had quite complex needs. So inevitably what happened was that when they left the institutions, they were even more likely to offend or to exhibit mental health problems. And today, I think about 83% of all the prisoners under the age of 20 have got a history of institutional care. So in other words, going to interstate care was almost a ticket to prison. You could almost guarantee that the next step would be that they would end up in prison. We talk with whānau and families who have a young person in prison and discover that their father or mother were in state care, and in some cases that their grandparents were in state care. So the state has, assumed a role here which almost seems to guarantee what will happen to future generations. So I think it's very important to break that chain of generational institutionalisation. One of the revealing experiences has been to talk with whānau and families who have a young person in prison and discover that their father or mother were in state care, and in some cases that their grandparents were in state care. So the state has, assumed a role here which almost seems to guarantee what will happen to future generations. So I think it's very important to break that chain of intergenerational institutionalisation. This government has been really supportive of restorative justice. And if restorative justice is about anything, it's about victims having the opportunity to tell the offender, how they feel about what's happened to them, the damage and harm that's caused, and then have the offender apologise and in some cases try to put things right. Now the impact of that process on the victim is significant because it may not give what we call closure, but it will help people on their pathway to healing. And just to hear those words from the offender it can make the difference between a victim feeling tortured and burdened by what happened to having that burden lifted and saying, well, at least the offender, has apologised and is doing stuff to put that right. Now, in this situation, the offender is the state, and the state has to front up in a restorative justice framework and say, we'll inquire into what happened, we're really sorry that it did happen, and we're going to do stuff that will put it right. I think that's the responsibility. When we approach an election, it's inevitable that the law and order issues will come to the fore, and we know that when governments demonstrate a tough attitude on those issues, they'll usually get votes. And it's been the same in every election since, in the last 30 years, I think. The difference here is that we have basic principles violated and basic values violated that are precious to all New Zealanders. And what all New Zealanders would appreciate and endorse is a brave move to conduct an independent inquiry and tell the truth. I think that's the vote catcher here, and we should encourage this government to do just that.